All right, start that over. So again, my name is Rusty Mahalik. I'm the library director at Goldie Beacon College at Wilmington, Delaware. We're very honored to have my friend Karissa Thacker, who wrote The Art of Authenticity, here. I want to do a couple two housekeeping things. One, I'm going to do a promotion for next week's group and group meeting, which is the ACRL Leadership Discussion Group, People, Programs, and Personality, Striking a Balance in Library-Led Justice-Oriented Initiatives by Aruja Nizami and Alex Ankalari. And that will be next Thursday, April 13th at noon. If you can join us, that would be great. There'll be, I'll put out the registration information in the ALA Connect. Karissa asked if you have questions throughout the presentation, just put them in the chat, and she will answer them as she goes at the end of her presentation. So now give a big warm welcome to Karissa Thacker.
Hi, thanks, Rusty. I am sad to tell you that I met Rusty on the squash court where he met me. So anyway, I won't hold that against him today. Karissa Thacker, that's my name. I'm a corporate psychologist, and I have been studying human performance and working with executives for the last basically 25 years. And over the course of that time, have come to understand some basic principles about how people perform in the world and how they don't. But at the same time, around 2015, I started noticing this concept of authenticity was popping in the media a lot. 2014 as well. And so this notion of, oh, be authentic, just be yourself, is so simple to be successful if you are just yourself. And it started bugging me a bit because I had worked with so many exceptional leaders in so many fields of performance, and knew that just kind of letting it all hang out and being yourself was not effective, nor was it healthy. So when I wrote this book and it came out, you see the first slide here, everybody would say, oh, that's a cool title. What the hell does that mean? Which I think is a fair question, because we don't typically think of authenticity as an art. But what I discovered as I dug into the research at a deep level was that authenticity, as it has been defined through the centuries, as well as in modern psychology, was not as simple as just be yourself. Authenticity comes down to the practice of being true to your ideal self, or to use Oprah terminology, your best self. Now, I won't gripe about that. I'll say that that's in the ballpark of what we're talking about. Oprah's your best self, but it's not exactly what I mean when I say the ideal self. Couple of points as we start. So in positive psychology, we study authenticity with the notion of helping people be happy, with the notion of helping people be effective and or happy. And what we think about in positive psychology, and you see the graph here, is that if there's too much difference between the actual self and the ideal self and the ought self, it creates imbalance. So the notion that a person who is fully effective has all three of these cells operating, and that there's a negotiation between three cells, works in terms of being more successful, being happier, if there's a sort of a necessary conversation, a peace made between these three cells. And then we also know from Tori Higgins' lab at Columbia that discord among these three cells tends to lead to depression and anxiety. So there's a plus side and a negative side. Now, the one that you have probably thought more about in your life is the actual self, right? My real self, be true to who I am. And you've probably had workshops on self-awareness. We all have. It's been a big buzzword for most of our professional lifetimes. But what are we talking about when we say our ideal self or our best self? And what are we talking about with the ought self? And in order to actually really get authenticity and embrace authenticity as a path, we need to go from self-awareness to selves-awareness, which is the big move, I think, in the art of authenticity, which is authenticity is really about allowing all three of these selves to be at the table in a more conscious way. Now, I'm here to tell you, as someone in my class used to say, are you calling me Sybil? For those of you who are younger, you may not know who Sybil is. It's a movie about a woman with 16 personalities. But the notion that we have multiple selves, those self guides are operating within you every day. Now, what we're talking about with the art of authenticity is making all three of those selves more conscious on an ongoing basis. And as you might guess, there are often major conflicts between the actual self and the ideal self, the ought self, who you think you should be. Simple things and more complicated things. You know, we can get really simple and we can say, I really want to lose 15 pounds and my ideal self is 15 pounds lighter, but my actual self really wants to eat candy, or, you know, whatever it happens to be, all the way down to more serious things like the way we treat other people in our lives. I want to be a kind person, but yet I'm feeling really cranky today. So all the spectrum of human behavior, from small things to larger things, really this model does encompass. And remember, there's three. So next time somebody says self-awareness, you can say, no, it's selves-awareness. Let's talk about the ought self. So back to this whole, you know, my real self, I'm going to be myself, the rest of the world be damned. We've all felt like this before, right? We all feel that way on any given moment. And damn it, I'm going to do what I want. I don't care what anyone thinks, especially my boss, my spouse, my 16-year-old. It's my way or the highway. The reality of most of our lives, we're in relationship with other people, we work on teams. We don't have the luxury of not caring what anyone else thinks. We just don't. It's a fantasy. So we all, you know, throw our hands up and get frustrated, maybe more so with those that we love and care about and get to this point. But reality sets in, and it really does matter how we interact with others and what our relationships are. So what is the ought self? So that's where the ought self comes into the equation, because the reality is that this notion that you are a self separate from your social environment, we actually know better than that now. It's very hard to even separate people from context. A great study from MIT came out about 3 years. I think it's 80% of your behavior and mine is determined by the 7 people we hang around with the most. So this whole social dimension to selfhood and authenticity is a big deal. Now, as you go through your life, you internalize certain things about who you ought to be. I ought to not cuss, you know, I ought to be in shape. I ought to be nice, you know, I ought to be smart. I ought to go to school here. I ought to go to school there. I ought to be promoted. If I'm not going up, what's happening to me? So this ought self that's going on inside of you all day, every day, which is usually not conscious until you begin to think about it, comes from current and past reference groups, your family, you know, a team that was important to you, what happened to you in college. So important people in your life weigh heavily here, but let me say that we're coming to understand that the culture, particularly with social media, and if we have questions about that, I can diverge to that a little bit, is making this self more sensitive to outside culture than people that you love. So we're seeing, for example, with teenage girls, crazy levels of depression in loving families because this ought self and these reference groups are in large part coming from online. So this is an emerging issue. But again, think about your ought self and how your ought self was born. A lot of times people are saying, "Oh, you're talking about my parents." Well, maybe it could be a coach. Could be you never know who's going to have the most impact on you. You may say, "My spouse tells me what I ought to do all the time." Fair enough. Interestingly enough, it's the things that people say to us directly often have less impact than the things that are implied or assumed. But that's the ought self. So the really important thing about the ought self, and remember back to what we're thinking about is how do all these selves interact? The really important thing about the ought self is its emotional tone. Now you see two demonstrations there. You know, when your ought self is going in your head, is your ought self, oh, like, you know, here we have the Amy Poehler picture here on the bottom is your ought self, you know, like, gee, I'm frazzled. I wish I could do more. I'm a people pleaser, blah, blah, blah. It's just not enough. I keep trying. Or your ought self might get pissed, might get angry. So ought selves always have an emotional tone. And I've done this workshop a lot, and I'm always fascinated by how quickly people can say my ought self is righteous, my ought self is judgmental, my ought self is angry, my ought self is always sorry, doesn't think I can ever measure up. So this kind of comes like it's almost just right on the surface for most of us. And the other thing you want to think about as you begin to sort of ease into, well, what's my ought self like and how is it impacting my behavior? You want to think about the fact that your ought self is like your fingerprint. It's unique to you and it changes over time. So this tool, this journal exercise tool, is very useful when you are struggling with a decision and you're trying to figure out what the right thing to do is for you, or what the right thing to do is for your team, how you need to respond to something, because it allows you to isolate the external pressures, the ought self, from what you're actually feeling in the moment. So a lot of times with clients, when they're struggling with a decision, they're struggling, do I fire this person? Do I not? They're struggling, wow, my team is very divided on whether we hire this person. You know, we can look at your decision as in a force field where there's pressures. Oh, we really got to hire somebody pronto. You know, you're not operating in a vacuum. And so there's an enduring quality to your individual ought self, but there's also situational factors that are occurring all the time in regard to pressures of the context. So if you play with that, after we talk today, some interesting things will happen. I find it fascinating. So I have done this workshop a lot with engineers, and the minute they say draw a picture of your ought self, they start, you know, oh my God, that's terrible, blah blah blah, and then they're like, I can't draw, la la la. Also with lots of other populations. And it's interesting how usually when we allow the right side of our brains, or that more emotional side, to draw something, regardless of how it looks, something interesting about your ought self materializes with that. So again, self-awareness, you've got the self that we always think of, the quote unquote real self. And then now you've got the ought self into the equation. Now, the ought self, I'm spending a lot of time on it today because it is popping, as I said, in the research for a lot of reasons in terms of context influencing us. And when I say a saboteur, what I mean with these particular constellations of behaviors and thought patterns is that sometimes our ought self can be like a mean judge. They just see everything, like they're Chicken Little, the sky is falling. Or your ought self can be someone who's like, oh, I don't want any conflict, whatever, I'll just acquiesce and, maybe I'll blow up in 10 years and go nuclear. Or the people pleaser, just keep moving. So you kind of see how these patterns manifest in all of our behaviors to some degree or another. But these are the ones that are the most common when we sort of look at ought selves and the way they're organized. And you probably, as you look around your team, there's probably at least someone in the mirror who you may go, oh, the conflict avoider, or the people pleaser, or someone else, who you've seen that behavior from. I always say to people, you're not allowed to identify your spouse's ought self or your coworker's ought self. The task really is for you to identify your own ought self. So I just throw that disclaimer out there for you. But once you really begin to think through your own saboteur, you can go, okay, am I making the right decision, or am I feeling pressure to please Rusty? Am I making the right decision, or am I just avoiding a conflict with David? That kind of thing. I'm ignoring this. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? If I ignore this, is it going to get a lot worse? Those sorts of things allow you to actually work with this insight from psychology about we all have an ought self. Now, we talked about, back up here to Tori Higgins, we talked about the real self, which is the actual self, the real self, which is what we tend to think of, oh, authenticity, be true to yourself. And we've talked about the ought self. Now we're going to shift gears to the one that's actually the most subtle and difficult to sort of wrap your head around. And like I said, it's kind of like your best self with Oprah, but it's quite a bit more complicated than that. Boyatzis at Case Western Reserve is the person who has done the most interesting research in this area. And Boyatzis is very concerned as an organizational behavior researcher and a psychologist by training at how people actually change in enduring ways over time. So the ideal self in his world is about what is this internal sense of the best version of you. And what we know is that there's quite a bit of continuity in regard to that when we get to a deeper level than I'm an extrovert. Ways to figure out what your ideal self is comprised of, you can do exercises like, okay, who do I admire? Who else do I admire? What are the characteristics of that person? All of this is in the book as an exercise I can't remember which chapter it's at the end of, but you have the opportunity in the book to go through and really flesh out your ideal self. Important, it's partially conscious and partially unconscious. And I always say partially conscious because most of us know when we're doing something that we really wish we hadn't done before. There's usually a sense of, ooh, I wish I hadn't done that. I wish I hadn't done it. So that's the conscious part. The unconscious part, remember, the ideal self is not as loud as what you're getting from culture. This is coming from in you. Think about how noisy our culture is. When Boyatzis originally did this research, it taught that the ideal self was a much quieter thing to assess than the ought self or the real self. And so think about now with all the noise coming at us, how difficult it can be to really have a sense of who you want to be at a deeper level. So it's, of course, socially influenced and self-determined with the ideal self. Now, what did Boyatzis, what's the big insight? And you see Boyatzis, he's not exactly a pinup model, but a very solid researcher. So what he discovered that is really, really important is that this force of the ideal self, if you do the work and get really clear about your ideal self, somewhat like a personal vision, but it's more about you specifically, it is a force, and it can really drive enduring change in terms of how you behave, how you lead, and how you operate in a team or in a family. You know, we're all familiar with the fact that if we want to change something, you know, we tend to behave in certain ways to avoid things. You know, I'm going to punish myself, you know, because I did something I didn't want to do, you know, slap me on the hand. Fear and avoidance motives work, but what we know about this deeper level and understanding the ideal self as a force is that it tends to last longer. It takes longer to sort of use this as a tool, but it tends to last longer. Now, I mentioned earlier that part of my journey with this book was to go back to the ancient Greeks. And this notion of a force, that this language that Boyatzis used actually goes back to Aristotle. And the word authentic actually goes back to Aristotle as well, because it goes to author, and the notion with authenticity is that you can possibly, if you are living as your ideal self, you live in a state of what Aristotle called eudaimonia, which is personhood at the next level. And there are all kinds of overlaps between the psychological and the more spiritual or the more theological when you really begin to peel back Aristotle's research. But what we're talking about is a person living at the top of their capacities to serve and to do good work in the society. Now, the ancient Greeks, as all of you guys know, your librarians contributed a lot to our society. It's a good and a bad thing. It's a mixed bag. But this notion of what is the point of human life and what am I supposed to do with myself is where we start with authenticity and with this ideal self. So what you're supposed to do with yourself is become your ideal self as you move through life. Hearing it on a practical level. Now, I said it's not loud. It's not like, you know, scrolling on Facebook. It's not easy. So your deepest passions, your duty, your calling, your aspirations, what really matters to you. And again, it's not like a siren. It's more like a voice, a gentle whisper. Now, you'll see this in the book, but I have clients who have worked with identifying, or I call it excavating, the ideal self in many different ways. But a lot of folks have found sort of having a bulleted list of this is my ideal self on a sheet of paper that is specific to them. Remember, your ideal self and your ought self and your real self are all specific to you. They're your fingerprint. They're you as an individual. So they have found it extremely helpful to have a clear sense of what your ideal self is. Who is it that you want to be? I worked with one client and his management was, we didn't give away our secrets, but his management was literally transformed by the notion that he would listen more than he talks. And the funny part about it is that he would always say to me, you know, I only talk like 4 times as much as I listen today. And so he never really nailed it in his own view, but it really changed the perceptions of others of him as a manager and a leader. So, he had like 4 statements. And again, keep it simple, keep it in front of you. You would be amazed at the power of keeping something that you're committed to in front of you consistently. What happens is that we stop looking at it because, like with him, if he wanted to talk all day and not try to listen, he would just not look at it, just let it go away. Because the minute you look at your ideal self statement, and the minute you commit, I value my health, you start to do something that's not valuing of your health, you experience cognitive dissonance. And there are many theories about why this ideal self is such an important lever in driving change. One of them is that if you can keep it in front of you, the consistency in front of you every day, it creates cognitive dissonance or makes you uncomfortable. But that is a challenge. I think reminders are very, very important with this. So the clues, how do you figure out who this ideal self is? A couple of questions that are really, really important. And I'm going to go straight to the one that's almost at the bottom. When do you feel joy? I'm talking about happiness, I'm talking about joy, which is a much, much deeper emotion, a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose. Another one that I find tends to really do a lot to unearth ideal self is when do you feel most alive? And again, these are great questions for a journal. You can do a lot of work toward unearthing or making more conscious your ideal self in a journal for 10 minutes. It's pretty amazing how much we have going on below the surface that we're not conscious of when we're in task mode every day. So circling back to, what is the art of authenticity? Remember, you've got 3 selves to lead. So from a leadership perspective, it's not just, I'll be myself. It's, there's sort of a team here, if you will. And when the heat gets on, what happens? There's not this nice balance, right? This necessary conversation. You're under pressure. You got to make a decision. Oh, I'm going to do this, right? My ought self says that. Oh, I'm going to go to work, even though I made a commitment to myself to keep weekends sacred. Whatever your particular challenge happens to be, you have to keep in mind that when the pressure is on, your real self might pop up and you might say, oh, who cares what anybody thinks? I'm just going to do whatever I want. That may not be an effective decision for you. That could be a decision for you that creates 9 kinds of chaos. But this point really in understanding self-awareness is how do you keep in mind that you are a complex human being and that all of this is operating within you, particularly in the heat of the moment, and really leaning into the value of taking what I call a timeout and just kind of stepping back and going, okay, what are the pressures here? What's going on with my ought self? How would my ideal self respond to this? What am I really feeling? I'm tired, I'm cranky, I'm great today, things are rolling off of me like water. It varies for all of us on any given day. And the last thing I want to say about the real self, you will find in the book several tools for doing more assessment on the real self than I have done today. And the primary model that you want to use for sort of real self-assessment that works with the art of authenticity is the Big 5. And so what we know in psychology is the most reliable way to understand our real selves or personalities, our natural proclivities, is this model called the Big 5. And that's totally explained in the book. And if you put that in Google, there's a wonderful instrument that has just come to market that will give you what I think is a pretty consistent and reliable version of that. So we've talked about the ideal self. We talked about the ought self and the real self. There's a lot more about that in the book. But what I really hope you'll consider is, how do you begin to take into account all three of these selves as you make decisions, as you move through life? And how do you begin to use this tool of the ideal self, which it's a little bit like an internal compass, but it's more specific than that. The ideal self statements tend to be very specific to you. You know, you're not going north, you need to go north for you. And again, the ought self, very specific to you. But I hope you'll begin to consider and think about, gee, how could I use this to be more effective in my job? How could I use this to be more effective in my family? How could I use this to be more effective with my friends? What might that be like to do that? And then I'll close with, you know, back to the notion that most of us, when we are struggling with you know, a challenge, these selves do get out of balance, like you see on here. You know, you can see how a person who's totally living from the ought self could be pretty miserable. You can see how a person who has not taken into account of the ought self can be pretty miserable, in that they've harmed relationships. So there is no sort of perfect balance between the two. But what I know for sure is that beginning to have necessary conversation in your own head or on a piece of paper is a powerful, powerful tool for being more effective and being happier. Remember where this started with, you know, why is it that people are anxious and depressed? So I will close with that. Rusty, why don't we allow people, if they would like, to ask questions just live with me, and then I'll check in on the chat as people come in. So questions from the audience?
I think there's one question, Karissa. Reed Jones asked, is the ideal self then related to Seligman's strengths and virtues?
Yeah, what Marie is referencing is the VIA, the values in action. And Marie, I think the ideal self, that's a great tool. And it is in the book about how to take that instrument. What Seligman and a whole group of positive psychologists did early in the 2000s is take a look at virtue and right behavior from a cross-cultural perspective. And they've come up with an instrument that gets at, you know, what are virtues like honesty that are valued in every culture, values like transcendence, values that are not necessarily tied to a specific religiosity or a culture, but they really do transcend all cultures. It's a great tool. Go to VIA.org and you can take it. And I often use it when people are crafting their ideal self. They'll often say, I know I have this virtue of curiosity, but I don't use it. Or I know I have this virtue of honesty, but I struggle to use it. So we'll often talk about, you know, which one of these virtues would you like to see come out more in your ideal self? You know,
that's a great answer. Thank you. Because that's exactly what I was thinking, that it would be good for figuring out, because of your questions about joy, and that sounded like the kinds of questions on the VIA. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a great tool for those of you who don't know, VIA.org. I see duality or dual consciousness playing into this. Fema, tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that. See that.
Hey, Karissa, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yep.
Yeah, so you talked about how each self is impacted when one is out of balance with the others. Yep. And I just wanted to know what your thoughts were of how either duality or double consciousness would play into this. Duality and double consciousness is when, people feel like they can't be their true selves, or there's conflict, or they're presenting another type or version of themselves versus being their authentic and true selves, and there's conflict. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on how you think that might be impactful given this schema.
Yeah, I think it's, and so there are folks who find themselves struggling to be whoever they are in a particular business context. There are folks who find themselves struggling to be true to themselves because we live in a culture that's heterosexist and in a culture that's racist. And what are the ramifications of that if I'm true to myself? I had a client in the middle of George Floyd summer who told me that her boss had come in and said, I don't think white privilege is a thing. And this is an African-American executive. How is she to respond to that? So I think that that's a very, very important use of the model in terms of what about when your real self and ideal self and or both in combination are in conflict with the rules of order in any environment. And I think the model is useful for the most part in very practical ways, which is, what's happening with your ideal self? Is your ideal self feeling squelched? Is your real self feeling squelched? What's going on with that? And I think that piece is a very, very important part of the work of that, because let's face it, all of us are at conflict with systems at times in terms of who we are. And all of us are at conflict with systems at times in terms of who our ideal self is. Systems are systems. They're not good, bad. They're not always in between. They're systems. So I appreciate the question. And I think there's a lot, if you happen to have students who are in difficult situations, I think that just the very fact of identifying the pressure that they're feeling to behave, heteronormative, or the way they're feeling pressure to behave white, or fill in the blank, whatever it happens to be, American. I think there's power in identifying that pressure in the force field. It doesn't solve the problem, but I can tell you this is a good tool.
Nancy Kramer said, what are your recommendations for someone who's new to these concepts? What would be the beginning steps to develop these selves?
The most important, probably first step, would be to do that work. And there's a bunch of journal prods in the book. And again, I cannot recall the exact chapter, but getting really clear on your ideal self and specific to you. Because remember that one is the one that is quieter and can be more powerful. Now, notice I say it's quieter and can be more powerful. You've got to up the volume on that one. So the first step would be to take some time, and 15 minutes you can do a lot. In the book, I talk about the prompts. Who do you admire? What do they share in common? Those kinds of questions can get you there. But I always challenge all of my clients to do their ideal self statements in bullets and to use I am. I am kind. I listen more than I speak. Whatever it happens to be that's specific to you. And it's really two things. One, which is what really matters to you. But I think the other piece is what really matters to you that you get better at. What matters to you that you get better at. What are the things that you hold dear? So that's a good first step, because so few of us take the time. We think, oh, no, we know what we need to do. We know who we need to be. Well, partially conscious, you know, partially unconscious. We know that if we really want to move towards something, it's better to be much more conscious. We know that. I even agree with Freud about that, and I don't agree with Freud about much, but I do agree with that. So the title of the book is The Art of Authenticity. Back to slide 1. I'm watching the chat. Joan, I see. It definitely scales up. Joan asked, do you think the model scales up to organizations? It feels like organizational resistance to change sometimes manifest in patterns like the saboteurs. I think that's fair. I think this particular model gets kind of complicated in organizational systems, where I can tell you that I have worked with it with success is at the team level. And particularly the team level, you know, 12 and under, you know, what's our ideal team? How do we actually function as a team? You know, what are the outside pressures that are hitting us as a team? That's very powerful. Organizations, it gets so complicated in terms of what part of the organization you're in, and those organizations, you know, the finance group has a culture. We just got a new leader in this group, and that person has a strong personality. So there's a whole lot that goes into the organizational mix that I think can make this difficult to put to work in exactly the same way. That being said, at the organizational level, we do know certain derailers to driving organizational change. And Joan, they're not dissimilar to those negative saboteurs. They're not the same, but they're not dissimilar because different organizations, you know, can sometimes have like a passive aggressive culture. Different organizations, you know, can have a non-trusting culture, et cetera, et cetera. Let's see if I missed anything else in the chat. The new to the concepts. Anybody else? Questions, comments? It's, you know, those of you who have children, I always find it fascinating when people come and say, you know, I said to my 8-year-old about an ought self, and they knew exactly what I was talking about. It's like, oh, that's really interesting. And then I said, well, did you talk to them about the ideal self? Yes. But I have found over the years that kids sort of have an intuitive sense of this, and are able to kind of click it. And most people, when you say the ought self, you kind of know what that is, because we all are familiar with the pressure. But I highlight again, there's tremendous power in, you know, stepping back and really isolating what the pressures are that are outside you.
We have another question, Karissa.
Oh, let's see, I'll scroll down. Kate. Oh, Kate. I am actually, in terms of publication, I am working on, it's actually a bit of a follow-up to the VIA, which one of you recognized, which is this concept of interfaith wisdom, meaning sort of the ideal, the real, and the ought self, and how do concepts like infused virtue and faith writ large play into this. So that one is very much in process. The research on social media, there's a guy at NYU, Kate, named Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T. And if you Google him, he is really doing, I think, important work in the area of people under 25 in mental health, particularly teenage girls. Now, he's not doing research in the area so much as he's amalgamating data. But basically his point is that in 2008, when we got the like button, it changed the world. And it changed all of our relationships to social media. And so it turned into this easy way to get either affirmation or negativity. And from my perspective, as at least an originally trained clinical psychologist, being exposed to that level of negativity has a totally different ramification if you're 30 versus 12. And in the pandemic, what happened was that a lot of kids had pretty much a frame of reference that was dominated by social media. So we are far from seeing the negative outcomes of that. And I think too, once you begin to sort of look around in terms of what's happened post-pandemic around what I'll call alt self disorders, it's pretty intense. But I do think his work will make you think twice if you have teenagers, and particularly teenage girls. Probably make you think 3 times. You know, we don't have a solution to it. And, you know, as I listen to folks, I mean, you know, taking the device away is not realistic for most of us. But that being said, it's something to pay attention to. And I actually, a client of mine has started talking about the ought self with his teenage daughter, and you know, to be continued. I don't know how that's going. But that being said, I think with teenagers in particular, this ought self can get really, really big. And it's not just about relationships anymore that are live and in person or on the phone. It can be a relationship with someone that you'll never, that can really impact your sense of self. That's quite a downer, sorry. We're getting toward the end of our time, but I do think there's a necessary watch out in this moment in our culture. And you guys, a lot of you on college campuses, same issues manifesting there. Again, 13 versus 18 or 19 or 20, very different situations developmentally, but again, a big deal for us to tune into.
Do you have any more questions for Karissa? If you haven't read Karissa's book, it's very good. Doing a promotion for her. So you guys, if there are no more questions, thank you all for joining us today. Been a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Karissa, for being here, and thank you for your time.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure. You guys take care.